I know that we Christians believe some things that are really hard to believe. I know that we Christians believe some things that if you're not a Christian, if you're not a follower of Jesus, well, I mean, good grief, it just seems ridiculous to you. And I'm going to let you in on a little secret. We Christians believe some things that when things are tough, when life gets difficult, when it's painful, when we're going through suffering, when nothing makes sense in our life, we believe some stuff that we actually doubt, that we actually start to go, I'm not sure it's true. I'll give you some examples, all right? For instance, we as Christians believe that God is all-powerful and yet at the same time immensely personal. Now, how in the world does that work? You're telling me that God is so big and yet at the same time he cares about my stuff so small, that God's so big and yet at the same time he wants to be so personally connected with me? I mean, I don't know exactly how that would work. I'm not sure, looking at my life, how that always plays out. Here's another one that creates even more questions and doubts. We believe that God hears all of our prayers. It's like, are you kidding me? There are almost 8 billion people in the world, and God's supposed to be hearing all of our prayers, all the time. Yeah. And which would lead all of us to ask, well, if he's hearing all of our prayers, then why is it sometimes that I'm praying and I feel like my prayers are just bouncing off the ceiling? Why is it I pray about, and ask for really good things, not for me, for other people, I'm asking for really good things, and nothing happens? Why would God not answer prayers that I'm praying that are good prayers for other people? I mean, you've wondered that sometimes. Here's another thing we believe that can be hard to understand, that God is for us. And the reason I say this is hard to understand is because if God's actually for us and on our side, then why are bad things happening to us? Why are bad things happening in this world? If God's really for us, why isn't he stopping things, fixing things, changing things? Because again, we think he's all powerful, right? So if he's all powerful, he could do whatever he wanted to do. So how in the world can he really be for me and yet let all this stuff happen to me or to the people around me? We believe that God has a purpose for our lives, which again, sometimes we're like, are you kidding me? Because my life feels so random. How could there be a purpose to this? Or my life is so difficult. How could there be a purpose to this? This is all stuff we Christians believe that's honestly hard to wrap your head around. It's hard to believe when certain things happen to you in life. But nothing compares to this one, to the one that we're here for today, that we believe God raised Jesus from the dead. I mean, good grief, what do dead people do? They stay dead. That's what they do. We have centuries of history and cemeteries full of evidence to prove dead people stay dead. And if you have a hard time believing this, I do not knock you at all. I totally get it. Because how could any rational, logical person actually believe a dead person came back to life on his own and walked out of his own tomb? I mean, who believes that kind of stuff? And yet we Christians, and you're here today, you're here because you're like, oh my gosh, they're celebrating. I'm supposed to be here. Mom asked me to come. So you're here. But it's like, how do people believe this? And yet here we are celebrating it. I mean, what is that all about? The truth is, and we're going to talk about this today, I want to show you not a lot, just like the tip of the iceberg, just a couple little pieces of evidence for why we believe this is true. And I want to show you not from a religious belief point of view, not from a, oh, you should just have blind faith and trust, not from a, oh, the Bible says so you should just believe it standpoint. No, I want to show you from an evidentiary, logical, rational point of view. I'm going to try to make that case in just a short amount of time as to why you can believe this actually happened. But the reality is this, and I'll just give you this off the front. If you can disprove this statement, if you can disprove that Jesus came back to life, well, good grief. The reality is we're all wasting our time. I mean, you disprove it, we shouldn't be doing this. If you disprove it, I am absolutely wasting my life. I should find something better to do. I mean, I like you guys, but we can hang out somewhere other than Sunday morning, right? It's like, we'll find a ball game or something to hang out at. I don't need to be here doing this if that didn't happen. And I'm not the only one who's felt this way. I'm not the only one who said this. You can go all the way back to the Apostle Paul, who wrote much of our New Testament. Paul, a guy who was persecuting and trying to end Jesus' followers and the early church. This guy was trying to kill it, put an end to it. And then he claims to have seen Jesus alive after he knew Jesus was crucified, because Paul was part of the religious group of the power structure, if you will, that had Jesus killed. And yet he claims to have seen Jesus alive after it, and he eventually, he flips, right? He changes direction. It's so odd. We talk about that another time, but it's so odd. It's some great proof that this actually happened. But about 20 years after the resurrection, Paul is writing a letter to Christians in the city of Corinth. Now, that's important. 20 years, that's all it is, 20 years after the resurrection. And he's making a case for why the resurrection happened. And you can, if you're interested in this, you can read most of 1 Corinthians 15 for yourself. But I just want to show you one statement he made in it. I find this fascinating. He says, if Christ has not been raised, in other words, if he's still dead, then our preaching is useless and so is your faith. This is Paul's way of saying, I am wasting my time. I shouldn't be doing this. I should find another line of work. And oh, by the way, you're wasting your time too. Your faith is useless. In other words, you can't just hold on to the good stuff. You know, in other religions, they're like, hey, you know, we've got good teachings here. And maybe there's some things that are a little sketchy, but you hold on to the good teachings. You can't do that with Jesus. This is Paul's point. It's irrational to hold on to the good stuff if Jesus didn't come back to life, because Jesus' whole point was not about the good stuff. It wasn't about the good teaching. Jesus' whole point was he predicted his own death and resurrection, claimed to be God, said, I'm going to prove it by walking out of a tomb. And if he didn't, you should throw it all away. You should throw it all away, because every bit of it's built on lies by someone who was a liar. So today what I want to do is, again, just give you a couple pieces. If I showed you all the evidence, historical evidence for the resurrection, you'd miss lunch, you'd miss dinner, you wouldn't be here. You'd just leave, you know. So I'm not going to do that, but I want to show you just 2 or 3 small pieces, maybe to make you curious enough to explore it a little bit more on your own. Because as Christians, and this is what I want you to understand, as Christians, we view the resurrection as a historical event, not a religious belief. Now, the reason this is so important is every other religion in the world, you just pick whichever one you want and research this, every other religion in the world is based on religious belief and religious teachings that were presented by their founder. And so their point is, hey, our whole religion is built on these teachings. You got to adopt these teachings. You got to hold on to these. They're true, and, you know, this is, everything centers around this. When Jesus showed up, he never said, hey, I'm centering everything on my teachings. He didn't do that at all. He said, no, I'm centering everything on this claim that I'm God, and I'm going to die, and then 3 days later come back to life. Everything about Christianity is centered on an historical event. This is what's so unique. Jesus and his early followers pushed all their chips into the center of the table and bet on the resurrection being true. The church bets everything on one single number, the resurrection. If we hit it, then game on. If we don't hit it, we ought to walk away entirely. And so, let me walk you through a couple of the reasons why you can have confidence that it's true. One of them is the actions and the reactions that the earliest followers of Jesus had both before, during, and after Jesus' death and resurrection. So if you don't know much about this story, I mean, when Jesus was arrested, these guys all abandoned him. They all fled. Peter, for instance, you probably know a little bit about Peter. You remember this. Peter denies Jesus during the trials of Jesus leading up to his crucifixion. Peter denies he even knows Jesus 3 times. And then he just flees. He leaves. He didn't want anything to do with him. And yet what is so strange is, just days after the resurrection, you find Peter proclaiming that he has seen Jesus alive. Just a few weeks after the resurrection, you find Peter standing up in Jerusalem in the very place where Jesus was crucified going, no, he's alive. And he's just like a changed man. As a matter of fact, he ends up getting arrested by the people who had Jesus killed because he's creating so much havoc, Peter is, in Jerusalem. And he stands, imagine this, he's standing before the people who he knows just had Jesus killed. So he assumes they're going to have him killed as well. If they could do it to Jesus, well, good grief, they could do it to Peter. And he looks at them. He looks at them in this moment when he should have been backpedaling, right? He looks at them, and here's what he says to them. He says, you killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead, and we are witnesses of this. And notice, he didn't say, oh, we believe this. We believe, we just had a vision, or we were told we believe. No, he says we're witnesses. We saw him with our own eyes. We heard him with our own ears. This is an event for us. This is historical. This actually happened. We're witnesses. And then Peter goes on to proclaim this over and over again until several years later, he is martyred. He's crucified himself upside down by the Roman Empire because he won't stop declaring he's seen a risen Jesus. Now, I could tell you similar stories about Matthew and, John and James and Andrew and all those other guys. I mean, this was a story for all of them. It's really hard. You ask yourself, how does an entire group of people go from being so fearful, so afraid? I mean, they're hiding, they denied Jesus, they're scared for their lives, to just a few days and then a few weeks later having such courage, being so bold. I mean, we could talk about that all morning. It's fascinating. But there's no rational explanation for that other than something happened. Something happened that was so extraordinary that they spent the rest of their lives not going around saying, oh, you got to remember this story Jesus told, this parable, this teaching. No. They went around the rest of their lives saying, he died. And I know it's crazy, it's unbelievable, but it's undeniable. We saw him with our own eyes. He's alive again. They spent their whole lives doing that until they all lost their lives for declaring it. I'll give you another piece of evidence for why you can believe this is true. And this may seem like an odd one, but we'll just step out of the Bible for just a minute, okay? There's actually compelling evidence that the resurrection happened because of a guy you remember from high school history class, Emperor Nero. You remember Nero? You may not know this about Nero. This is fascinating to me. Nero became emperor of Rome when he was 16 years old. Now, I want you to think back to when you were 16. Imagine getting your driver's license and becoming emperor on the same day. You think our country's been in rough shape for the last decade or so. I mean, can you imagine what you would have done to it at 16? Anyway, that's beside the point. So here Nero is, the most powerful man in the world, ruling the most powerful empire in the world, 16 years old. A few years pass. AD 64. You know what happened in AD 64. You remember this? Nero burned down Rome. And who did he blame it on? The Christians. You say, well, what's the big deal about that? Well, the big deal about that is this is about 30 years after the resurrection. Just 30 years. And there are now thousands of Christians in the Roman Empire. There's so many Christians in Rome that Nero can point the finger at them and say, it was them and I'm trying to get rid of them all. Now here's why that's significant. You read any sociology you want to read and they will tell you that it takes between 60 and 80 years for a legend to arise and be adopted. So if you think, this resurrection story is just made up. All right, well, here's what sociologists say. It takes 60 to 80 years for that to begin to happen, to begin to gain grip. Now, why would you think it would take 60 to 80 years? Well, it's obvious. Because all of the eyewitnesses who know what actually happened or did not happen, they all have to die off in order for the legend to begin to take root and to grow. You can't have eyewitnesses around going, no, I was there. They're making that up. No, I was there. That's not how that went. So legends develop, long after an event happened. But we're 30 years from the resurrection, when all the eyewitnesses are still alive, when you could go to Jerusalem, you could, go to that area and you could talk to people who were there and you could say, did it happen? Did you see him? Did you not see him? Because over 500 people claim to have seen Jesus alive for, a few weeks after the resurrection. You could go talk to him. And yet here we are. Just 30 years later, there are thousands of Christians who have adopted this. Thousands of people, not just Jewish people, but non-Jewish people, Romans, who are now believing and following in Jesus, who easily, if it could have been disproved, it would have been disproved. One more piece of evidence I want to show you real quick. It's actually the accounts themselves of the resurrection. Now, there are 4 different accounts of what happened on that third morning after the resurrection. Matthew wrote one, he's one of Jesus' followers. Mark wrote one, he got his account from Peter, who's one of Jesus' followers. Luke wrote one, who's a medical doctor, and he investigated everything that happened, interviewed all the eyewitnesses, and then put an account together. And then John, who was one of Jesus' closest followers, John wrote one as well. Here's what's interesting. All 4 accounts have some significant details in them that actually lend extraordinary credibility to the fact that the accounts are true. Let me show you what I mean. I want to read John's account to you of what happened that morning, but you can read any of them, and you'll see this. Here's what John said happened. He said, early on the first day of the week, okay, Sunday morning for them, early on the first day of the week while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. You may not be familiar with her. So Mary Magdalene was a lady who had encountered Jesus a couple years earlier. She was an extremely broken woman, and in experiencing and encountering Jesus, she had found some extraordinary healing, and she had begun following Jesus, been a passionate follower, helped provide some things for Jesus along the way. She was actually there. All the men scattered. They were scared to death. But Mary Magdalene was one of the women. There was a group of women who were there at the crucifixion watching Jesus die. She had watched Jesus be put in a tomb by 2 guys, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. So she had seen all this happen. And she shows back up, and she's actually, if you read some of the other accounts, you read it in context, she's there with a group of women. They've come back early on Sunday morning. We don't even know if the sun's up yet. They've come back as early as they can. And the reason they came back is because Nicodemus and Joseph, they had to bury Jesus quickly. Sabbath was coming. Jews couldn't do anything on Sabbath. So it was a rush job, okay? And there was a certain way Jews prepared bodies for burial. And they had done it. And these ladies had been watching and gone, they screwed that up. So early on Sunday morning, they're coming back to clean up the mess that the guys have made. And for 2,000 years, you ladies have been doing that for us. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. We really do. So anyway, that's why they're coming, okay? And so they're bringing all the appropriate burial spices, and they're bringing all the stuff you got to do to properly prepare somebody for burial, because they just wanted Jesus' burial to be respectful, all right? So that's why they're coming. So Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. When she gets there, she's shocked because there's a big stone that had been rolled over, and the whole point of that was because it'd take a lot of people to move it, and they didn't want it moved, right? So she goes to the tomb, and she saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. And so she's shocked by this. And John tells us, here's what she did. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. This, by the way, is how John refers to himself in his own account. Now, John and Peter grew up together, okay? They've been best buddies their entire lives. So this is just John's way in his account, because he didn't know we were all going to be reading it today, right? This is his way in his account of needling Peter and saying Peter was there, and then the other guy that Jesus loved more than Peter was there too. That's all John was doing. So Simon Peter and then John, the other one Jesus loved, okay, she shows up to both of them. They're hiding. They're still hiding in a place in Jerusalem, or just outside Jerusalem in Bethany. So she shows up to them, and she says this to them. She says, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb. We don't know where they have put him. This is fascinating. Mary Magdalene does not assume there's been a resurrection. Now, Jesus predicted it. He taught about it. He told them. None of them expected it. None of them believed it. None of them got it. She thinks, and understandably so, she thinks, oh my gosh, they either moved his body, don't even know who they are, but they either moved his body or his enemies came and stole his body. But either way, it's terrible. And so Peter and John do what you would expect. It's early and they can sneak out and nobody will see them. It may still be dark. So they're so curious, they take off. They both run to the tomb. They get to the tomb. They look in. They see it's empty too. All the linens that Jesus was wrapped in, they're laying there. Everything's there, but it's empty. And they're as confused as they can be. And you know what they do? They turn around and they go back home before anybody sees them. Now, this is fascinating to me, because if you're making up a story, how are you going to write yourself into the story? You're going to write yourself in as a hero. If I'm making up this story, here's what I would have done. I would have said, if I'd been John, and John would have probably done this, I would have said, you know what? We got to the tomb, and Peter didn't believe it because Peter never had any faith. And he just left, but I knew, I knew all along. I knew he was alive. I started telling people, you can see him for $99.99. You can see him, I know where he is. This is not what they did. They're like, no, we had no idea. We were so confused, we just left. Now, Mary Magdalene had gone back with them, okay? So Peter and John are like, we don't know, but we don't want anybody to catch us here, so they're out of there. Mary Magdalene stays around, and John tells us this happened. He says, now Mary stood outside the tomb crying, because she's, again, she doesn't think he's alive. She thinks he's been stolen or taken away, that they've lost his body. He's not going to get respectful burial. Imagine if somebody that you love deeply or cared deeply about, imagine if you had their funeral and their burial on a Friday, and then you show up on Sunday to, tidy up the gravesite and put some flowers, and the casket's gone. You'd be upset too. This is how she felt. And as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels in white, which may seem weird, but she didn't know they were angels, okay? It'll be obvious in a minute. She didn't even know they were angels. They were seated where Jesus' body had been, and one of them was at the head, the other was at the foot. And they asked her, well, woman, why are you crying? And I'm sure she thought, isn't it obvious? What do you expect? Isn't it obvious? So she's very consistent. She says, they have taken, don't know who they are, but they have taken my Lord away. I don't know where they put him. I don't think he's alive. I think he's gone. His body's just disappeared. I don't know where they put him. And then the story gets a little comical. And we lose all this because, we're 2,000 years later and it's church. We're supposed to be all solemn. We lose. This is a funny part of the story. John says, at this, she turned around and she saw Jesus standing there outside the tomb. But she didn't realize it was Jesus. Maybe it's because he's standing far away. I don't know. Maybe it's because he's behind her. Maybe she was, ladies, again, not to pick on you, but sometimes y'all have those cries, like those cries, you know what I'm talking about? Where so much is going that you can't see anything. It's just like waterworks, Anyway, she's probably got that going on. So I'm trying to cut her a little bit of slack, okay? But for whatever reason, she does not recognize Jesus. And Jesus has a little fun with this. I think he's got a smirk on his face. I think he's chuckling as he looks at her and he says, well, woman, why are you crying? Who is it that you're looking for. And this is the best part. Thinking he was the gardener, she said, Sir, if you've carried him away, will you tell me where you put him and I'll get him? Now, can you imagine? I mean, for years and years after this, Mary Magdalene would be at dinner parties, and they would say, we hear you were the first one that saw. Oh, yeah, I was. Tell us the story. And she'd get this sheepish look on her face and be like, do I tell them the truth? Or, well, guys, I did see him first before anybody, but I thought he was there to water the flowers, weed the flower bed. Totally missed him, Can you imagine how embarrassing that was? I think everybody just laughed. She's like, I told him I thought he was a gardener. I thought he was a gardener. And then, as she's standing there in that moment, I think she's still crying. She's not paying much attention. She just thinks, maybe the gardener knows. John tells us this happens. Jesus said to her, Mary, and the minute she heard her name come out of his mouth, she knew. She turned toward him. She cried out in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. And then she did exactly what you would expect her to do. Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, I have seen the Lord. And she told them that he had said these things to her. Now, let me tell you why that account, and you can read any of the 4 accounts and it's the same. Let me tell you why some of the facts in that account actually lend extraordinary credibility to that account. I want to point out 3 things, okay? In all of these accounts, women were the first to find the empty tomb. Women were the first to see Jesus alive, and women were the first to tell the men that it had happened, okay? Now, here's why that's so significant. In our day and time, you're like, well, yes, women are always on top of things before us. So we wouldn't expect anything less. They always know what's going on ahead of us. And we think, guys, no, I know what's going on. I know it. And then you're like, well, do I really know what's going on? Or did she just make me think it was my idea and I figured out what was going on, but she knew? Anyway, that happens in my house all the time. So here's why this is so significant. In the first century, and some of you have heard me talk about this, women had 0 credibility. In the first century, you could not call a woman to court to testify on your behalf because they considered their testimony invalid and not credible. So, let me ask you something. If you're making up a story, if Matthew's making up a story about it, if Mark is, if Luke is, if John is, if you're making up a story that you're trying to get everybody to believe, that you're trying to get first century Jewish men to believe, do you make up a story where women are the first ones to find the empty tomb, to see Jesus alive, and to tell the men what had happened? No, you don't. Why would you write that into the story? Well, you wouldn't. Not in the Jewish culture. You wouldn't, unless that's actually how it happened. So, here's why all of this matters to us. Because if you're going, okay, Easter's always a big deal, I don't understand why. Here's why it's a big deal. It's a big deal for you and me because you can trust everything Jesus said because he rose from the dead. All that stuff we talked about at the beginning, that you're like, sometimes I just don't know. I'm not sure. Does God really care about me? Does he want to be that personal? Does he hear my prayers? Is he really for me? I mean, look at everything happening to me. Is he really for me? I don't know if God has a purpose for my life. It seems like everything's so random. You know why you can believe that? Listen, if you're a follower of Jesus and you're like me and you find yourself in moments where you're doubting those things, you know what you do with all those doubts? You just carry them all the way to the resurrection. You anchor everything about your faith to the resurrection. Because if that happened, then you can trust everything else Jesus said because he proved he was who he said he was. And if you're not a follower of Jesus and you've got questions and you've got doubts, listen, this is why it's worth you exploring the evidence for whether the resurrection happened or not. And I've just given you a tip of the iceberg, but it's worth you exploring it. It's worth you exploring it because what if it's true? Imagine what your life would be like if you woke up every day and you were absolutely confident God was with you and he was for you, that he loved you, that he'd forgiven you, that he had a purpose for you, that he heard your prayers, that he was personally involved in your life. I mean, you may not believe that, but imagine for a minute what your life would be like if you did believe that. Imagine if you woke up every day confident. You knew that was true. Well, if the resurrection happened, you can be confident in all of that. If the resurrection happened, you can know you're forgiven, part of God's family, that He's with you and for you. If the resurrection happened, then it's game on. It's all true. In just a minute, we're going to end with a song. And this song is a great reminder that God is for us. That His forgiveness is offered to all of us, that His grace is free, that His love is endless, that our hope in Him is secure, that we don't have to doubt, that we don't have to wonder. As we sing this last song together, I hope you'll take a moment to reflect. And if you're not sure, if you're wondering, I hope you'll make a commitment to figure out for yourself what you believe about the resurrection. If it didn't happen, game off, find something better to do with your time. If it did happen, you can trust everything He said because He rose from the dead. That will change your life forever. I know, because it's changed mine. So, if you will stand with me, I want us to pray together before we sing. Let's pray. And if you're sitting there and you're somebody who's going, I've always wondered, but oh my gosh, I do believe. I believe Jesus died. He rose again to prove that when He died for my sins. He died to offer forgiveness. He died to make me a part of His family. If that's you, I just want to invite you to tell Him right now, okay, Jesus, I give you my life. And I'm going to put my trust in the fact that your resurrection happened, which means you are who you claim to be. Just tell Him, thanks for the grace that you give me so freely. Thanks for forgiveness. Thanks for making me a part of your family. As best I know how, I'm going to follow you. Jesus, we're so grateful that you didn't just ask us to believe something, but you actually left us plenty of evidence to trust in. That you said, here's all the proof you need to verify I am who I claim to be, and I walked out of the tomb. Today we celebrate that. We celebrate the fact that so many of us, we have found life in you, we found forgiveness, we found grace, we found hope because of you. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.